He took the house, he took the car, he took every dollar they had ever saved together. What Richard Mercer didn't realize, as he walked away from his 74-year-old wife without looking back, was that he had overlooked the smallest, most forgotten piece of her life. The one thing that would make everything he took meaningless in the end. If you've ever been made to feel like you no longer matter. If you've ever had someone look straight through you like you were already gone, then stay with me because this story is for you. Subscribe if you're new, because what we do here is find what remains when everything else has been taken away. October dragged dry leaves across the driveway as Lillian Mercer stood on the front steps of the home she had lived in for nearly 5 decades. Her thin cardigan was pulled tight around her shoulders. Not because of the cold, though it was cold, but because of the hollow feeling spreading through her chest. The kind that arrives when something final has already happened, but your mind hasn't caught up yet, when your body is still standing in a life that has already ended. Behind her, through the open door, movers carried out the last of the furniture with the detached efficiency of men paid not to notice. They didn't pause, they didn't wonder. They just carried and loaded and moved on, the way people do when someone else's loss is their ordinary Tuesday. In the driveway, Richard stood beside a sleek sedan, new, polished, entirely out of place against the aging home, checking his watch. Not with guilt, not with grief. With impatience, the way a man checks the time when he's late for an appointment, not when he's ending a marriage of 48 years. That's the last of it. One of the movers brushed his hands together. Richard gave a short nod, pulling a folder from under his arm, the same folder that had spent 3 months quietly erasing her. Documents, signatures, court stamps. Each page stripping something away until there was nothing left to divide. Lillian stepped forward. Her voice came out quieter than she expected, almost swallowed by the breeze. "Richard." "This isn't right," he sighed, not the sigh of a man in pain, the sigh of a man who finds something inconvenient. "It's done, Lillian. The house is legally mine," a slight shake of his head. The judge was very clear. She looked past him. At the faint outline on the wall where their wedding photo had hung for decades, the ghost of a frame on faded paint. At the porch railing he had built with his own hands the summer their son was born. And the memories came rushing in: birthday candles, late-night conversations, laughter bouncing through rooms that now echoed with absence, so fast and so full that for a moment the world tilted. Then his voice pulled her back. "You'll need to take what's yours and go." He gestured toward the 2 suitcases at the curb, a vague, dismissive wave. As if her life were something you could gesture at. "What's mine?" she repeated, the words caught in her throat like something she couldn't swallow. "That's all the court assigned to you. The rest was purchased under my name." She searched his face for regret, for hesitation, for even the faintest flicker of the man she had given her life to. But there was nothing there, just a distant, businesslike calm that made him feel like a stranger wearing her husband's face. 48 years, she whispered. "And this is how it ends." He didn't answer right away, just adjusted his cuff as if the conversation were an interruption he was politely tolerating. "You'll be fine," he said eventually. "There are places you can go, facilities." The word landed like something dropped from a great height. Facilities, not homes, not options, not "you'll be taken care of." Just somewhere to put things that no longer fit where they once belonged. Lillian's hands trembled. She kept them at her sides. "I don't need a facility. You can't live alone," he replied. Still not looking at her, as if eye contact might cost him something. "That's not your decision to make anymore." And something tightened in her chest at that, not anger, not yet. Something quieter and more devastating. The slow recognition that somewhere across the years her voice had been reduced to something optional, something easy to set aside. And now, at the very end, it had been removed entirely. Not in one dramatic moment, but in 1,000 small ones she had never thought to count. A gust of wind moved across the driveway, scattering leaves against the suitcases at her feet. Richard reached into his coat and produced an envelope, extended it toward her without meeting her eyes. "There's some cash here," he said, "enough to get you started." She didn't take it immediately. She just looked at his hand, at the unfamiliar distance in such a simple gesture between 2 people who had once known every inch of each other. Then she reached out and took it. Her fingers felt oddly numb. "Started where?" she asked softly. He hesitated, just a fraction of a second. But she caught it. She had spent 48 years learning to read the pauses between his words. "That's up to you," he said, stepping back toward the car. The engine started with a smooth, quiet hum, far too refined for a moment this brutal. Lillian stood there as he opened the door, still half expecting something to stop him. Some last crack in the cold certainty that had taken over him, some return of the man she once knew. She had loved him for so long that the habit of hoping hadn't died yet, even now, even here. He paused once, hand on the door. She held her breath. But he only said, "Take care of yourself, Lillian," in the same tone someone uses to end a phone call, and then he got in, closed the door, and drove away without looking back. The car disappeared around the bend, the exhaust faded, and the silence that rushed in to fill the space was so complete it felt almost physical, like something pressing against her from all sides. Lillian didn't move for a long time. She stood beside the two suitcases that now represented everything she had left, staring at the empty road as if staring hard enough might undo it. Might rewind to a morning when the light came through the kitchen window in that particular way she had always loved, and everything still made sense. And she was still someone whose presence in a room was noticed. But the road stayed empty, and the truth settled in slowly, the way cold does, not all at once but by degrees, until it's in your bones and you can't remember being warm. She had been left with nothing, or at least that's what Richard believed. Minutes passed, maybe more, she couldn't tell anymore. Eventually her legs gave out from under her and she lowered herself onto the curb, the rough concrete pressing through the thin fabric of her skirt, grounding her in a reality she wasn't ready to accept. She sat there staring at the cracks in the pavement, at the weeds pushing through the seams, at the small stubborn things that survive in the spaces no one tends to. Her hand drifted into her handbag, searching for something familiar, something untouched by lawyers and courtrooms in the cold language of division. Her fingers closed around something small, something solid, a key. Old brass worn smooth at the edges, its surface dulled by decades of quiet waiting. She pulled it out and held it in her palm, and for a moment just looked at it, really looked, the way you look at something you forgot you still had. And then a memory surfaced, faint at first. Then clearer, sharper, the smell of pine trees, wind moving through leaves. Her mother's voice calling her in from the porch of a small, hidden place far from everything, a place that existed outside the noise of the world. A place Richard had never once asked about. A place that had never appeared in any document, any signature, any courtroom. A place that had remained quietly, entirely hers. Lillian closed her fingers around the key, and something shifted. Not outside, not in the world that had just discarded her, but somewhere deep inside. A small, steady warmth in the hollow place, like the first coal catching in a cold fireplace. She lifted her head. For the first time since the car disappeared, her eyes were no longer fixed on what she had lost. He thought he had taken everything. But as Lillian Mercer stepped off the last bus with two worn suitcases and one old brass key held tightly in her hand, she understood, maybe for the first time in years, that there are things lawyers cannot touch. Things that don't appear on property listings or bank statements or court documents. Things that survive precisely because no one thought to look for them. The road ended miles back. What replaced it was a narrow dirt path half swallowed by weeds and time, and each step Lillian took felt heavier than the last. Not just the weight of age, but the weight of everything she was carrying that had no physical form: grief, disorientation. The strange dislocation of a woman who had spent half a century building a life, only to watch it loaded into a moving truck in an afternoon. And yet there was something else too, something quieter, steadier, a thread of memory pulling her forward through the trees. The air changed as she walked deeper in, cleaner, cooler, carrying pine and damp earth and something almost imperceptible underneath. Something like the past, held in place by distance and silence. It had been over 40 years since she had walked this path, back when her hair was still dark, back when her life still felt like her own. She began to wonder if she had remembered it wrong. If the years had invented a place that no longer existed, if she would arrive at the end of this path and find only trees, and then she saw it. First just an outline through the branches, a shape where no shape should be, then clearer with each step, more solid, more real, until there was no mistaking it. The cabin still standing. Smaller than she remembered, but aren't all childhood places. Its wooden boards weathered dark by decades of rain, the porch slightly tilted, one railing leaning just enough to show that time had not been entirely gentle. But it was there, solid, unbroken. And most importantly, untouched. Lillian stopped a few feet away, her breath catching, not from exhaustion. From something closer to disbelief. The particular shock of reaching for something you expected to be gone and finding it still there, still waiting, as if it knew you were coming. "You kept it safe," she whispered. She wasn't sure if she was speaking to the house, the land, or the memory of her mother, whose presence seemed to live in the quiet spaces between the trees. In the particular way the light fell through the branches, in the smell of the air itself. Her fingers found the brass key. For one terrible moment doubt moved through her. What if it doesn't work? What if time took this too? She pushed the thought aside. Climbed the creaking porch steps slowly, carefully, until she stood before the door. The same door she had run through barefoot as a child. The same door she had leaned against as a teenager, listening to her mother hum softly in the kitchen, not knowing enough yet to understand how rare those sounds were. The lock resisted. Stiff with years of stillness, as if testing whether she truly belonged, she held firm. And then, with a soft, clean click that seemed louder than it had any right to be in all that quiet, it turned. The air inside was cool and faintly stale, carrying dust and old wood, and something beneath both of those things, something familiar that hadn't entirely faded. Something that smelled impossibly like before. Sunlight filtered through the small windows, catching particles drifting lazily through the air as Lillian stepped inside slowly, almost reverently. As if moving too fast might break whatever fragile spell had kept this place whole, the furniture was still there. Draped in white sheets yellowed with age, but carefully arranged, not abandoned but preserved. The old wooden table exactly where she remembered it. The small stone fireplace untouched. A stack of neatly arranged logs still waiting beside it, as if someone had been preparing for a fire that simply hadn't been lit yet. Along the walls, shelves held books, jars, and small objects that felt less like clutter than like intentions, pieces of a life set down deliberately, not forgotten. Lillian set her suitcases by the door. The sound echoed softly through the stillness. She walked further in, her fingers trailing lightly over surfaces, relearning them, the grain of the table, the rough stone of the fireplace, the curve of a chair she had sat in 1,000 times before she knew what sitting in a place you loved actually meant. "Mama," she said under her breath. The word slipped out before she could stop it, and the silence that followed felt somehow almost like an answer. She moved to the window and pulled back the curtain. Light poured in, warm and direct and generous, and with it came something she hadn't felt in days, maybe years, a sense of clarity. Of being exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to do, with no one's permission required. Because here in this small, forgotten cabin, nothing had been taken. Nothing signed away or divided or reduced to numbers on a page. This place had existed entirely outside of all of that. Untouched by the man who had spent 3 months dismantling her life as if it had never mattered, she stood in the light for a long moment, just breathing. Then she went to the bedroom. The old quilt was still folded at the foot of the bed, the one her mother had made by hand, each stitch a small and quiet act of love. And in the corner sat a wooden trunk, its surface worn but intact. Lillian knelt in front of it slowly, her knees protesting. She lifted the lid, not valuables, not money. Not anything Richard would have understood the worth of. Notebooks, dozens of them stacked with care, each one filled with her mother's handwriting. Neat, deliberate, covering page after page with recipes and remedies, observations about the land, ideas about living simply and well. Knowledge rooted so deeply in this place it couldn't have existed anywhere else. Lillian picked one up, opened it slowly, traced the familiar curves of the letters with her fingertip, and something moved through her chest, quiet, unexpected, and entirely her own. She understood, sitting there on that floor surrounded by her mother's words, that this cabin was not a hiding place. It was not just shelter or survival, it was a foundation. One her mother had built and left behind, not carelessly, but deliberately, as a gift timed perfectly for a moment like this one. Richard had taken everything he could see. He had missed the one thing that mattered. If you're still here, thank you. That means more than you know. Maybe you're watching this because you felt what Lillian felt. That particular loneliness of being looked through by someone who was supposed to see you. That particular grief of losing not just things, but the version of yourself that existed within them. If that's you, you are not alone, not here. Hit that like button if this story is sitting with you. And in the comments, I want you to tell me, has there ever been something in your life that everyone overlooked, something small and forgotten, that turned out to be exactly what saved you? I will read every single one. Now let's get back to Lillian. Winter arrived and settled in slowly, and Lillian let it. She didn't rush. She didn't make plans or set timelines or tell herself she needed to be further along than she was. She simply began, which is the hardest and most necessary thing a person can do after the life they knew has been taken apart. She cleaned room by room, pulled away the yellowed sheets, opened windows that hadn't breathed in decades, and let the cold, clean air move through the cabin like something being exhaled after a very long time. And with each small act of restoration, the space changed, not just physically, but in some harder-to-name way, as if the walls were remembering what it felt like to be inhabited. What it felt like to matter. Her mother's notebooks became her guide. She read them by lamplight in the evenings, fingers tracing each line like a hand being held. They were full of practical, grounded knowledge: how to preserve fruits and herbs, how to make simple remedies from what grew nearby, how to tend the land with patience rather than force. But between the practical lines there was something else, a quiet philosophy, a way of seeing the world that valued what endured over what impressed. Lillian read until her eyes were tired. Then she slept better than she had in years. By early spring the land began to soften, green pushed through the cold earth. And with it came something Lillian hadn't planned for, the first signs that what she was building might be seen. It started almost accidentally. A few jars of homemade jam on a wooden crate at the edge of the dirt road, a handwritten sign, more out of something to do than any real expectation. Someone stopped, then another, then a few more. And before long, what had begun as a quiet experiment had become something steady, something real. Travelers passing through began to recognize the spot. Locals made the trip intentionally. And Lillian found herself in conversation with strangers again, not as someone being managed, not as someone being tolerated, but as someone offering something of genuine value. Something she had made, something that was entirely hers. The weeks became months. The garden expanded, vegetables and herbs growing in careful rows, guided by her mother's notes. The porch was repaired, straightened, given a small table where her goods were displayed. Jams and breads and dried herbs and simple remedies, each one carrying the quiet weight of her effort and her time and her choice to keep going. And somewhere along the way, she couldn't name exactly when, the hollow feeling that had spread through her chest on that October driveway began to fill, not with what she had lost. With what she was choosing, with what she was building day by day from the ground that had always been hers. She heard the car before she saw it. The low hum of the engine cut through the afternoon quiet in a way that felt immediately wrong, too polished, too certain, too much like a world she no longer belonged to. Lillian looked up from the table where she had been arranging jars and watched the vehicle slow at the edge of the property before coming to a stop. For a moment she didn't move, just watched. The driver's door opened, and Richard stepped out. He looked older than she remembered, or maybe she was simply seeing him clearly for the first time in a long while without the blur of proximity. His posture was less certain, his movements slower. Time had caught up with him in ways it seemed to have left her, and something about that struck her not as satisfying but as simply true. He looked around at the cabin, the garden, the table with its jars, the small but undeniable life that had taken root here, and something moved across his face. Surprise, maybe. Or the particular discomfort of a man confronted with evidence that contradicts everything he assumed. "Lillian," he said. The hesitation in his voice was new. She didn't invite him forward. Didn't offer anything. Just met his gaze with a steadiness that would have been unthinkable to her on that October curb. A woman sitting on the concrete with numb fingers and two suitcases, and the specific devastation of being handed an envelope and told to start over. "Richard," she said simply. He shifted his weight, glanced again at the garden, at the jars. "I heard about this place," he said, gesturing vaguely. "I didn't think it was." "No," she said quietly. "You didn't think about it at all." The words weren't sharp, they weren't angry, they were simply accurate, and somehow that made them land harder than anything she could have shouted. He looked away. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its old certainty. "Things changed. The house, it didn't work out the way I expected. The costs, the maintenance, it's complicated." Lillian said nothing. She had learned across a long winter of quiet work that silence could hold more truth than words. She waited. He cleared his throat. "I thought maybe we could talk. Figure something out." The air between them stretched. The wind moved softly through the trees. And Lillian took a slow step, not toward him but to the side, placing herself between him and the cabin door. A small movement, almost imperceptible, but it was hers. "You already figured everything out," she said gently. "Remember?" A flicker of something crossed his face. "That was different." She shook her head, a small, quiet motion. "No," she said. "That was exactly the same." He opened his mouth, closed it, and for the first time in all the years she had known him, he seemed genuinely uncertain. Not strategically uncertain, not the practiced hesitation of a man choosing his words carefully, truly uncertain. As if the ground he had always stood on had shifted beneath him while he wasn't watching. "You took the house," Lillian continued, her voice steady and unhurried. "You took the car. You took the bank account." "I know," he said quietly. She rested her hand against the wooden frame of the cabin door, felt the grain beneath her palm, rough and real and solid. A thing she had fixed herself, a thing she knew. "And you thought that was everything?" A long pause. "Wasn't it?" he asked, quietly, almost to himself. Lillian met his eyes fully without flinching. "No," she said, "it wasn't." The words hung in the air between them, simple and final and entirely without malice, and something in Richard's posture changed. The long, unexamined certainty he had carried for so long, the certainty that he had won, that she had been dealt with, that the matter was closed, began visibly to give way. She watched it happen and felt nothing she expected to feel, not triumph, not satisfaction, not even the particular relief she had imagined in darker moments might come from this, just clarity. The quiet, uncomplicated clarity of a woman who finally knew exactly where she stood. You took what you could see, she said softly. But you forgot the one thing that was never yours to take. His gaze moved to the cabin, to the garden, to the life arranged carefully around her. And she could see it in his face, not just what he had missed, but what that missing had cost him. Not the land, not the money, not any practical thing, something harder to name. Something he would spend a long time understanding. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument they had ever had, filled with everything that no longer needed to be said. After a moment, Richard nodded slowly. I see that now, he said. Lillian looked at him for one final moment, and then she did something she hadn't expected to do. She felt something like compassion. Not forgiveness, that was a longer road and one she would walk on her own terms in her own time, but compassion. For a man who had spent his life taking what he could see and never learning to look deeper. For a man who had driven away from 48 years without looking back and was only now beginning to understand the weight of that. Take care of yourself, Richard, she said. Her voice was calm, final. Entirely her own, and then she stepped inside and closed the door, not with anger, not with grief. With the quiet, unshakable certainty of a woman who had lost everything she was told she had, and found, in the losing, everything she actually needed. Outside, Richard stood alone at the edge of the property he had never known existed. The trees were still. The afternoon light was gentle and indifferent. And the truth he had driven all the way here to avoid had followed him regardless. He had taken everything he thought mattered, and in doing so, he had lost the one thing that actually did. That's Lillian's story, and I think you already know why I needed to tell it. It isn't really about a cabin. It isn't really about a divorce or a key or a jar of jam on a wooden crate at the edge of a dirt road. It's about what survives. About the parts of us that exist outside of what other people can see, name, or take. About the quiet, stubborn truth that the people who try to erase us almost always miss something. They always miss something. If this story reached you today, if it reminded you of your own strength, your own overlooked places, your own small brass key waiting at the bottom of a bag, then please share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe if you haven't, because we tell stories like this here, stories about people who were written off and built something anyway, stories about finding what remains. Leave me a comment and tell me, what does it mean to you to start over, not the fear of it, but the possibility of it. I'll be reading, I always am. Because we are all, in our own way, standing at the door of a cabin that has been waiting for us. The key is already in your hand.